We've begun this series with first a conversation that Justus and I had with each other a couple of weeks ago to start this off. And then we proceeded to explore our history as Blacks and Jews and folks who come from both of those backgrounds. And now we're coming into today and this moment that we're in. And in large part, we're at Hartman are having this conversation right now, not only because of the events of the last 6 weeks, but in fact, because of a realization that has been coming over the last several months and years, in fact. Many of you may be familiar with the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leaders Institute, which is a program for Muslim leaders in North America. And as that group had been convening amidst all of the social change of the last few years, it became necessary to actually look at the race element. This is not something that Hartman is traditionally used to doing and facile at, but it became necessary to bring it into the conversation. And I would also say that in addition to the work with Muslim leaders in North America that had brought this in, Hartman's own work on Jewish values and democracy, which both Graie and I participated in some work earlier this year on, also raised the question of where does race and racism fit in to our work as a Jewish community, both internally and externally. And so there were some external pushes and some internal pushes and some social ones that are bringing us to this conversation today. And I'm really excited to be joined by two amazing organizers and folks in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community as well to have this conversation about understanding the moment that we're in. We have seen the recent killings, most visibly of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May, at the hands of police, re-energizing the movement for racial justice in the United States. And today we want to explore how are Black Americans and how are American Jews interpreting this moment. So we're joined by Graie Hagans and Maayan Zik today to have this conversation. I'm going to introduce them and then invite them into some conversation with a couple of questions. And we will have some time at the end for a Q&A. So folks, if you have questions that are coming up as we go along, pop them into the chat and Justus and I will be monitoring them over the course of the time, and then we'll curate them for the last portion of our conversation. Graie Hagans, he, him, his, is the national organizer and training manager for B'nai the Ark, a Jewish partnership for justice. He's an organizer, facilitator, and political educator. He is a board member of Jews in All Hues and is building Black Jewish community and power with the group Black Yids Matter. Maayan Zik is a member of Caravel and also co-organized the Tahalucha for Social Justice, which called on Orthodox and Chabad Jews in Crown Heights to march against police violence in June 2020. Since then, she has been featured in Vogue magazine, The Washington Post, and more. She was raised in Washington, D.C., woot woot, and lives with her husband and 4 children in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, New York. Thank you both for joining us. And Graie, I'm going to kick off the first question to you. Y'all do not necessarily know that Graie and I have worked together for a while, so we go a little bit farther back. And so I'm kicking this off to you to get us started. We're having this conversation today in this series of 4 weeks, in large part because the United States and the Jewish community are having this conversation about identity, about progress, about systemic racism and the need to dismantle it, and all of our various roles that we play in pursuit of it. Is there a difference from your perspective in the tone and texture that these conversations between the Jewish community and within the Jewish community and with and among the wider American community writ large than we've seen before? And are we as a Jewish community, because of our history, because of our present and past, all of the things that make us a little bit different, are we better or worse equipped than the community at large to have conversations about these really tough topics?
First of all, I just want to state an appreciation for being invited into this conversation by Ginna. This is a conversation that I'm having kind of in the multiple facets of my life. And a couple of things I'm sitting with right now. One is that we're in a new moment of the conversation, but it's not necessarily a new conversation. I was doing some morning reading this morning. Professor Lila Berwin-Corwin here in Philadelphia has done some sociological research on the development of Jewish American identity. She talks a lot about, particularly in the 1940s, about a lot of the work around developing an American Jewish identity that was well rooted in the idea of being an American citizen as being core to like making American democracy come true, and about being about the public good and all the kind of impacts and shifts that's had on kind of American Judaism and our collective identity, and also how we're seen kind of in the larger American story. I think we're interesting in this moment right now, whether it's the 40s or the 60s or now in 2014, 2016, 2020, back in a new moment of having to reconcile and I think deal with kind of these challenges right now is interesting. So I think like there's a history, and some of the things that I'm sitting with is I think that history does well equip us. I think we have the tools. We don't necessarily have a lot of practice at using the tools. And for me, like that is the difference, right? It's like the tool set is deep. We have both like thousands of years of tradition and text and practice at kind of wrestling and reconciling and making meaning in all the places that we've been. But being in this moment and particularly wrestling with how Jewishness and Jewish history and Jewish identity really fits into the larger fabric of American white supremacy and American democracy and American racism, we're still getting practice at, because it's actually a much smaller period of our much larger history, right? Who are we as a diaspora in this space? And I think part of what that means is that there's a particularly kind of Jewish expression of how we find ourselves in that, and then there's kind of the overlay of like the American story, right? And when I think about what has it meant for largely for us as Jews in the United States to have found so much safety and security. I kind of repeatedly hear the story about the United States being like the safest place in kind of the history of global Jewry, or this is the safest place in diaspora. What does that mean directly juxtaposed with how America has not been safe for lots and lots of other people, kind of from foundation? What does it mean that for lots of us, this is a place that's given us like material safety through economy, through the political sphere, through the social sphere, the cultural sphere. But like, what does that mean when that same system has also like directly been about the suppression and oppression of other peoples based on their identity as well? So there's always been, I think, a little bit of a trade-off, and I think some of that continues to come to a head right now, whether that's in the conversation in the way it's coming through right now about safety and security through police, or kind of the policing industrial complex, about how do we see security for ourselves in a moment when like police also are seen very much in position as agents of suppression for so many people who, we share space with and share community, and ideally share a vision of the United States as a place that actually has safety and security for all people. And so I think we're in a moment of like shared vision of wanting all people to be safe, and the kind of how we get there and what are the practices feels still really shaky to me. So I think well equipped, but how much practice we have in our equipment, I think is an ongoing question.
Thank you, Graie. Maayan, before I ask, I have a question for you too, Maayan, but before I do that, I want to ask, did Graie's analysis, does it ring true? I mean, you organized a march in Crown Heights for Orthodox and Chabad Jews for whom marching in the streets is not necessarily new, but marching in the streets for social justice in this way probably felt new. And so what was that like, being a leader, positioning yourself in a place to organize a largely white community, a largely new to this community in this moment?
Okay. So it came about, a group of friends and I, we have been since 2016 with regards to the presidential election. We made a group called After the Ugly Cry on Facebook, and then transferred that group to WhatsApp for the recent Democratic primaries. So, besides talking about politics amongst ourselves, amongst our own progressive group, because we really needed a space that we felt like, we're not crazy. We're not crazy for being progressive and being Chabadniks, and those two worlds mixing. It's not a crazy idea. So we talked about various other things besides politics, and now, you know, the whole thing with George Floyd came up, and we began discussing, like, you know, how do we, you know, discuss racism with other people who may not see our views? How do we go about, you know, because we didn't want to be in the position of being bystanders while all these wrong things were happening. And people are just kind of like, you know, everything goes viral on the internet. It's so easy to just spread this, like this. And it's almost like that that story of the boy who just, you know, he has a bag of feathers and it blows out into the wind and he can't recollect those things. So what's said is said, and we wanted to help shape the narrative and say, hey guys, you know, based on the Torah that we have, the framework that we've, you know, that we have been living our life by, it says these things about social justice, about how we should be behaving in this time, in this environment, and that sort of thing. So we found various ways to maybe like, okay, let's gently, like, you know, answer that question, or gently like shift this person towards a better understanding of why the thing that they said was not a good thing, like why the racist thing that they put out there was not the best thing to do. And even getting into uncomfortable little mini, I always call them wars. It really should be discussions, but little mini wars on Facebook and in threads and things. So we do that. But in any case, so we were just getting to the beginning of phase one, where we, you know, because lots of people had the criticism of like, well, you know, why are all these people protesting? And it wasn't fair that we were, you know, kept at home and now all these people are protesting. What's that all about? You know, our community felt attacked because—
Maayan, you mean the fact that there were ordinance, like restrictions putting on people gathering in public, right? And the protests were allowed to happen, but Jewish institutions were not allowed to meet and daven together, right? So there was like this double standard happening. Perceived.
Yeah, like we couldn't have weddings, we couldn't have funerals, and those sort of things. So this double standard of being called out on social media by the mayor, and the mayor saying, hey guys, we're going to ticket you if you continue to do things like that, and that sort of thing. It felt like a double standard to a lot of the community for, no, you can't have that big funeral that's necessary for the healing of your family, but we can have this protest in the streets that's necessary for the healing of this country. You know, it's a little bit like that. So we felt more comfortable to do our protest towards the beginning of this phase one thing, etc. So we're not necessarily within that double standard place. But in any case, so a friend, Miriam Levy-Chaim, she was like, oh, you know, I really want to do a protest on Sunday. So we were looking at all the organized things that were available, you know, like we wanted to put our bodies in that place and say, hey guys, we're with you and we stand with you and we're here to support you in whichever way you say you need that support. And we couldn't find anything that was necessarily organized for that time, that particular time that we wanted to go out and do that. So we decided to create our own. So she brought that up. She's like, hey guys, what if we made our own? And we were all like, yes, this is the greatest idea. We should do that. And, you know, and within that, we're like, you know, this could be a very good thing for our neighborhood, because within, you know, like beyond seeing all our different people in our networks and in our communities saying racist things, there were other people who were standing up for the Black community and saying, hey guys, what you're saying is wrong, and X, Y, Z, this is what it is, you know? So we saw that there is interest, but there was a trepidation because you know, there was the concentration also of the fact that a lot of, or some of these protests were very violent and they're looting and this sort of thing. And our point of it was, you know, guys, that's not the focus. The focus here is that Black people in this community, in our country, are facing great injustice, and we need to focus on this issue right now, and we need to help them, and we need to show support for this movement from that perspective, and not concentrate on the violence that's happening around it. Those people are being distracting, just like forget about the distraction, focus people. So we thought that our protest would be a very good space for those people who were just kind of like silently lurking in the background, to give them a space to feel safe at a protest, and then also show their support. And also for anyone who was curious, we could give them, like baby steps as to how to fight racism, how to listen to the Black community, and also a little bit of, we had speakers like before, and we started this on Thursday. We started planning this on Thursday before the Thursday. It was a Sunday, and we started planning this the Thursday before. We made a flyer, and then we're like, we're committed to this. We're doing it. Yes. Whether we have speakers or no speakers, whatever it is, we're all going to show up at this particular place, and we're going to say our piece, whatever is flowing in our heart about this thing, and then we're just going to walk on Eastern Parkway, and that's going to be the thing that we do. And then, so before Shabbos, no speakers. Motzi Shabbos, all the speakers. So we spent like all of the night before just, making arrangements, making final touches, doing the whole thing. Anyone and everyone just contributing to whatever we could. A lot of us live in Crown Heights. Some of us don't live in Crown Heights and live in other parts of the country, whether it's like New Jersey or Michigan, like things like, or Vermont, and places like that. They used to live in Crown Heights, and they felt, concerned for the community and wanted to help in this way. So if they could help, financially or just with whatever skill sets they had, they just contributed that, and that's it. So I felt that it would be the best thing for myself as like, I think, I'm the Black Jew of the group. I'm not, they don't tokenize me or anything like that.
I was about to ask you that. I was about to ask you, when you say we and us, who are we and us? Are you the only Black woman who is a part of this contingent? And what was it like? Were they able and willing, this group of folks who were from Crown Heights and abroad and beyond, were they able to follow your leadership? Like, did you encounter any challenges in leading or being a leader of this effort, either within the group or outside of it?
So I would say that a lot of us are white, I would say white Jewish people, basically. But there's a Persian in the group. There's myself, another Black Jewish, the Black, like a Black American Jewish person. The Persian girl, Miriam Levy-Chaim, she's Persian, of Persian background. Her family's from Iran, and they had to escape Iran and the whole situation over there with that. But in any case, she says that often she does get mixed up for being like Puerto Rican or or something like that. Yeah. So sometimes people also, take her for like a Jew of color, but I don't think she thinks of herself as a Jew of color. She really more identifies with being Persian. Interestingly enough, like two friends in the group are like of Irish and Scottish background, so they really strongly identify with that contingent of their thing. But yeah, mostly the general kind of like white Jewish people. When it came to organizing this whole thing, they did ask me, like, they would, they would stop and pause every once in a while and say, hey, are you cool with this? As a Jew of color, as the person who is also part of the Black community, how do you feel about what we're doing here? How do you feel about, like, if we're planning this or doing that, and they listened to me a lot on this project and really tried to center my voice. And I think we had within the group, I had like, and maybe a few days before we started planning this, and we'd started discussing more in depth about like, well, what does racism feel like? And it's like, hey guys, local Black person here. I have a few experiences. Let's talk about it. So yeah, so I would just, I left voice notes on WhatsApp. So they took their time to listen to that, and they were like, we're holding space for you in our hearts for your experiences and what has happened to you. And even like beyond the Jewish world, in the Jewish world, and that sort of thing. So that. If there was any more to that question, please remind me.
There will be more later because we still have still got some time. But you mentioned other protests that had taken place around the country, like around the same time, right? Obviously, thousands of protests were happening over this period, right? Everywhere. And some of them did become violent. Now, there's different narratives explaining how and when that happened, but the fact is that people were hurt, people were injured, and and property was injured as well. And you mentioned the distraction, that focusing on that piece. And I want to come back to Graie, actually picking up on this notion of distraction, because I think that personally, I feel like we've been distracted again these last few days. We have seen a number of influential Black people trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes and rhetoric, using words and language that are not new to anybody. And there's been a range of responses to that. We have seen, CBS Viacom canceled Nick Cannon with a quickness, but then Deshaun Jackson from the Philadelphia Eagles had a little bit more support. Julian Edelman reached out and said, hey, come, let's talk. Let me take you to the Holocaust Museum. There are different ways that we have seen responses pan out. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about the dynamics in the context about these dynamics of anti-Semitism coming up, and particularly from influential Black people that has received differing responses in the context of this current social movement for Black lives. What is the difference between, what can you sort of parse out anti-Semitism and weaponizing anti-Semitism, and talk a little bit about what that looks like, and the impact in particular of the events of the last several days on Black Jews, and how it shows up in us and among us in this moment. And maybe a little bit about how anti-Semitism behaves differently than other oppressions, particularly in the United States, just so that we can all be holding the total picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that feel important to address in that, right? One is I'm finding still, and I'll say a lot of my work over the past few years, I've served on multiple kind of training teams trying to get more clarity about how does anti-Semitism function? How does it function as a system of oppression? How is it different than other kinds of racialized oppression? How is it similar? How is it part of the fabric of racialized oppression and white supremacy? And what I'm finding more and more is we are still collectively learning, what does anti-Semitism mean in the United States context, right? I think we've all been a part of conversations and training and developing a narrative that really looks at kind of a much longer history and about how some of that's been translated into the United States. I think we're still collectively struggling to look at what are the consequences of anti-Semitism uniquely in a United States context. And part of it is the ways in which anti-Semitism interacts with other forms of racialized oppression. There's a particular relationship of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There's a particular relationship of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, of anti-Semitism and Orientalism, of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. And I think right now we're again in a moment of looking at how the two function. I think for me to pull it back, part of it is understanding that if we understand that anti-Semitism is a system or a structure of white supremacist oppression, then we have to understand that it has a goal that is about us and is about also maintaining the white supremacist structure, right? And anti-Semitism largely functions in the context of conspiracy theories and a way to try to make sense of how for, I think much of kind of the right, how to make sense of the ways in which progress movements have been successful in a U.S. context, right? There's a lot of scholarship about the ways in which particularly kind of the white nationalist, white supremacist right in the United States kind of turned towards the weaponization of anti-Semitism following the civil rights movement. Particularly, how do you make sense of if part of your fundamental belief is that Black people are fundamentally inferior to white people? How do you explain the development of Black power in the United States and the success of Black movements in the United States, the economic, political, social, cultural success of Black people in the United States? Well, part of it is what the right found, and what they've been relying on is a narrative that Jewish folks are secretly behind Black progress and Black liberation in the United States. And so that becomes weaponized in a way to really work towards like disintegrating ties in movement work. Whereas anti-Black racism primarily functions in the dehumanization and creating like labor out of Black people, whether that is through being, through chattel slavery in the history of the United States, or through the use of prison industrial complex and creating a whole new labor pool of forced labor in the United States. That particularly relies on the idea of of fear mongering of Black people. Black folks are just more frightening. Black folks are more frightening and gathered together. Black folks are more violent. Black folks are more XYZ. And so there's ways in which those movements sit together really clearly. And I go back to oftentimes, I remember a few years ago, I lived in Philadelphia, and there was an article 2017, 2018 about our district attorney, right, Larry Krasner. It was all this movement activity to get Larry Krasner elected in Philadelphia. He was a good movement lawyer, and now he's the DA. And seeing across the country this trend as movement folks were really turning towards district attorneys' races to try to make real shifts and do real deep reform work across criminal justice across the United States. And there's this article kind of in a mainstream, fairly kind of progressive publication in Philadelphia that opens with the imagery of a Texas DA who has a tattoo across his chest that says something like "free them all." And it weaves in kind of this like classical tropes of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia, and also names George Soros as a secret funder behind all of this. And that article for me is so clearly about how there's such a deep narrative about secret Jewish money and control and puppetry behind like movement forward of repairing like the deep harm and fissures in like, if there is an American covenant, we're in a place of deep harm and fissure in that covenant. And so the weaponization of anti-Semitism often comes up amongst folks who are positioning themselves against progress, oftentimes in the name of some set of conservative values or maintaining some version of a past America that has been taken away from them. And so it's interesting to me to think about then how are we collectively positioned into that story. And so I think this moment right now is particularly interesting because how do we also hold like anti-Semitism, like racism, like sexism, like homophobia, like transphobia, it's deeply woven into the fabric of our country in the way that we are in relationship to one another. And therefore it comes out of us, whether or not it came from us or not, it comes out of us, right? I think so there's questions about how do we hold that Jewish communities are not immune to racism in the same ways that communities of people of color, Black communities are not immune to anti-Semitism. And also those things didn't come from us. They're part of actual structure, which means that there are economic, cultural, social, political, religious, et cetera, ways in which our world is constructed for us, in which we only interact with one another primarily in kind of prefigured ways for ourselves. Pause to get myself some water.
Do you have more to say? Keep going, because
I can say more unless you have a question.
I feel like there's been a lot of just energy and typing and texting this week, particularly about Black people and anti-Semitism among Black people. Like, just to double down on what you were just saying about the fact that communities are not immune to our own internalized oppressions, either of ourselves or of others, right? Like there is white supremacy that people of color and Black people experience too and internalize as well. Is there, there's been, I think, for white Jews, a fair amount of perhaps righteous, not righteous indignation about seeing all of these instances of anti-Semitism coming out of Black people. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that, just that piece of the dynamic, and like where the demands should be and shouldn't be, and where our attention should and shouldn't be in this midst.
Should I give my frank answer to that question, Ginna?
I want well, you know what I want.
I don't like to lie as practice. I think that there's a couple of things. I think one, again, just to say, anti-Semitism in that way functions just like racism, just like misogyny, just like transphobia. It exists in our spaces because people come to our spaces as they are, right? So I think part of it for me as an organizer and a political educator is what does the work look like to do to help people dismantle kind of the influence of those systems and actually forge better practices of how we be together, right? The work is not just in like casting off, but it's like, what is the alternative that we're taking on? And the reality is that doesn't happen if we don't stay in the room and be in relationship to each other. And I think for me, part of that is as a Black person, as a Jewish person, as a trans person, I don't feel much option to walk away from the movement, right? Like I very clearly see the movement is for the sake of my life. And so I think there's something about how do we understand ourselves in that context. And because of that, I think there's something about how do we re-understand the function of power in systems of oppression. I would argue that I think we've gotten to a place in, I think we've gotten to some place in our like racial justice work. And I think about Ibram Kendi, for instance, and the way that he frames when he talks about racial equity and racial justice, he's not talking about interpersonal connection and dynamics, but really how power flows and who does and does not have access to the levers of power to make their agendas and their imagination of the world possible and manifested in the world. And I think when we understand how power is deeply racialized in the United States context, and we operate fundamentally in a hierarchy of racialized power in the United States, in the same way in which we know that anti-Semitism continues to persist, even as there are Jewish folks who are in like the halls of power, from federal to state to local government, in boardrooms, in places where real decisions and power are moved. We also have to hold and understand that there are Black folks in those spaces as well that doesn't shift that racism and anti-Black racism and hierarchical white supremacy is at play, right? And like some of having that, having people who are in those spaces also goes to serve the overall system. Because
the
of that,
overall
I do think,
system of white supremacy, right? We're able to say that because we've got some Black folks in the boardroom, we're good. Because we elected Obama, we're good, right? Is that part of it?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. So part of it goes back to, right, like the idea that when former President Obama was elected, that we're in this like post-racial America because now there is a Black person in the highest seat of power in the United States. So therefore racism must be different. It must have been a massive shift through that election, right? We know that's not true. The movement for Black Lives started during Obama's presidency, right? The work around highlighting the egregious nature of police violence, the lack of overall infrastructure around police accountability, things like that, predated, but really that the movement began in its current iteration while Obama was president. So we can't quite be post-racial if those things are true and happening at one time. I think another part of this story has to do with, and I imagine some folks when they hear the term intersectionality are a little bit like, oh, I still don't quite know what that means, or it makes me have feelings about it. But intersectionality in its most classical sense of understanding how do people's social identities and social indicators, how do they actually connect in ways that determine the conditions of people's lives, right? How does, for instance, race and gender, right, the experience and the systems of control and the structures of power for white men is different than Black women for reasons of race and gender, right? That's kind of, so for me, thinking about like, again, being a queer Black trans Jewish person, right, I'm living at the intersection of those power structures in a way the white supremacist power structures impact my life. which means like I'm attentive both to anti-Semitism and to anti-Black racism and to transphobia and to homophobia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those impact me across, you know, healthcare, economically, educationally, politically, socially, et cetera. And so I think there's something also about, though, the ways in which systems of oppression also operate at intersections, right? And the ways in which anti-Semitism and, again, anti-Black racism are particularly triggering and hooking one another right now. And some of that is what I see around some of the specific narrative of Black anti-Semitism, as if Black anti-Semitism is different than some larger version of anti-Semitism. I don't know if the correlator to that is white anti-Semitism, right? And I think it's interesting. Part of it, I think, has to do with the story that we have in the United States about the relationship of Jewish folks and Black folks, one as like binary community, that there are Jewish people and there are Black people. And I think there's a story about that history in the United States, right? And I think that history comes through as collectively as American Jews, we found a lot of our position in place and kind of the fabric and the story of American democracy through the civil rights movement. And I think part of the lasting impact of that is a sense of we are a justice-rooted people, and we've been committed to racial justice in the United States, you know, since the civil rights movement. And therefore, there's an idea of connectivity. And sometimes I think an idea of like Black America owes something to us collectively as Jews for our participation in that struggle, right? What it leaves out is understanding again.
That one more time?
Like,
I think that right there is where I thought we might get in this interrogation of the dynamics around Black people saying things are anti-Semitic. There may be a feeling of a debt that is owed. How could they do this to us, or how could they not do this for us? Right? Like I just want to like put a finer point on that, because I think it's like really clear and present.
And I think it comes through in lots of different, thank you for, I think it comes through in lots of different ways, right? I think it comes through in kind of multiple different ways. And I'll just say, like, that's a thing I've heard point blank. I have heard folks say that out loud, right? Like, we've done so much for them. Why aren't they doing more for us? Is an interesting construction. It's an idea of like transactional solidarity, right? That there's a reciprocity that has to be met on our terms. And again, I think it lacks the nuancing of very real power dynamics. And I don't say that because I think anti-Semitism is less critical and important for us to get clear about, but I say that because I think we need to get more critical and develop a better understanding of how power is fundamentally in the United States racialized. It always has been. That is like foundational to the construction of how American policy, American economy, American society operates. And so when I think about things like the story that we have about Jewish participation and leadership in the civil rights movement, right, oftentimes lacks, I think, some of the nuance of understanding power dynamics. For me, the most like classical way to reflect that is around the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, right? When we think about, right, like how often that gets named, and particularly Goodman and Schwerner get named as Jewish martyrs in support of the civil rights movement, which they unquestionably were. And also what happened when the two of them were murdered, along with James Cheney, who was a non-Jewish Black man, who was a lifelong resident of Mississippi, is that there was no federal, there was no law enforcement, manpower or resources put into finding him. Resources were put into finding, right, white Jewish folks who had gone missing. And of course, what they found was mass graves of Black folks who had been being murdered throughout the summer and the previous spring and the previous winter and the previous fall and the summer before that and the spring before that, if you get my drift. And so what does it mean that there was a lot of mobilization of white Jewish folks, particularly from the East Coast, coming into the South to want to do deep work around following the leadership of Black liberation thinkers and being willing to make deep sacrifices, and also that story doesn't contain room for the very real experience of what the power dynamics of American white supremacy and racism do when the disappearance of those two men triggered a federal investigation to finding the two of them. And what they found, again, were mass graves of Black folks who had been disappearing in the area for months and for years. So there's questions, I think, for us about what that means and what that looks like, and how do we understand power dynamics in that. And so again, like, what is the story that we're told, and why is there a narrative about Black anti-Semitism particularly? This isn't a new narrative, right? This was also came up in 2016 when the Move for Black Lives First released their platform. You know, if you go back to one of the things I most love to do is looking through the archives of Commentary magazine, which has recycled the same story about Black anti-Semitism for the past like 40, 50 years. You can go back through the archives and it's like the same article ready to go anytime something happens. There seems like a particular fascination, and I think some of it has to do with figuring out what is our relationship to Blackness historically and now where we are, and what does it keep us from seeing and understanding? Right? Yeah. Why are we more attentive to that and less attentive to there is a rising movement organizing itself around an idea of reclaiming the United States as a white ethno-state, and actually has access to the federal government, state governments, local government, its own media across social media, its own levers of economic power that are actively mobilizing across the country. We saw them at the beginning of the lockdowns, right? Coming together in the form of like states liberation or, you know, reopen the economy protests. When you look at who was populating those protests, you see a pretty wide swath of the right, but you also see it very clear when you dig into who populates the kind of extremist far right. You're seeing the Boogaloo Boys at the front of that, right? Who are expressly an accelerationist white nationalist formation that is dedicated to not property damage, but is dedicated to actively murdering people, right, to bring about a race war, which for them brings about their ultimate goal of a return to a white ethno-state in the United States. So sometimes the questions of what...
Yeah, and I was saying, and this white ethno-state, to your point of this country just being a racialized one and one of power, and one where Jews, you know, I think there was a question coming up in the Q&A about the Jewish privilege Twitter thread that has the hashtag that's been very popular in these coming days, right? So thinking about this all white ethno-state, even though white Jews in this country are able to sort of take on the yoke of whiteness and accept it, they're not included in this white ethno-state, right? This white ethno-state is just for white Christian people only, not for just about anybody who is on this panel or in this audience right now. Graie, you talked about not being able to leave the table, not being able to leave the conversation, needing to be in relationship with everybody who's on the side right now of right and of liberation and of progress. I've mentioned, it has come up in prior sessions. People know that I'm on the board of Women's March, and people know that Women's March had its own real run-ins with anti-Semitism over the past few years. And I would just say, I was going to speak to that, but you spoke to that just now, because I think when you said that when lives and liberation are at stake, it is really important for us to be willing to remain in conversation and to stay at the table and to not write off those who may not know and who may not have learned. And I think I want to go back to Maayan right now to sort of dig into that a little bit more, because you run in Chabad circles, I run in modern Orthodox circles. I don't know about you, but I began in 2015, 2016 with the Trump ascendancy. I began to shelter my own Jewish engagement and Jewish experience, because in some of these circles, there was rhetoric that was embracing of Trump. And there is problematic rhetoric and racism at Shabbos tables all the time. I think I've said in prior sessions that I have white friends who are they're my crew, that I say, hey, can I accept this Shabbos invitation from this family, or am I going to end up regretting that I was there? So how do you navigate needing to stay at the table and needing to continue to work to bring people in when sometimes, quite frankly, white Jews make it really hard?
Okay. In terms of Shabbos table things, I've sheltered myself as well. My husband is willing, my husband is Israeli, actually. so he doesn't really get too involved with the politics of America too much. He's more, well, you know, he's Israeli, so okay, fine. He's like more into that. But he does have friends who are more pro-Trump and do have a tendency to sometimes influence a few things that he might come home and say to me about, well, my friend said this and da 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 da. And so I'm not really, it's like, as much as I would like to shelter myself, it's still coming in through some little pipeline there. But in any case, so I get into discussions with him, like, you know, well, your friend says this, and I respect that your friend believes these things, but I frankly just don't understand how your friend or anyone could really support Trump when I think, like, for instance, like the day after the election, it was like a Wednesday. Usually I go to a Wednesday morning class, like a Torah class with these ladies, and it's a mixed group of women who, like, politically mixed group of women. And so I was just like, okay, I'm like, I'll keep it together. It's gonna be fine, like whatever, just as long as no one says Trump. Like, just no one say Trump, and then I will be fine. I won't cry, and everything will be good. And then, like, after class, literally somebody was like, so what about that Trump? And I was like, ah, and I was like, oh God, and like scream cried, and I was like, we're all gonna die. And they're like, why are you so worried? I'm like, because he incites people who are willing to take people sorry to be so graphic, but he incites people to that are possibly going to hang other, that's what I said at the time, that he would incite people to hang Black people. And I was literally, that, like, I'm scared of that, like, all the time. And I don't, and also, like, you know, he incites the KKK, and I'm very concerned about that. And the KKK don't just hate Black people, they hate Jewish people, they hate everyone that's not a white Christian person. So I just don't, and so I don't understand how they could like Trump, but this is a reality. They do like Trump for whatever mysterious reason they like Trump. So I just have to, I mean, if it happens, I've just been a person who just goes, okay, whoa, cool, great. I'm just gonna stare down at my plate now. We'll just play around with a few things here, and you know, also if I'm going to someone else's house, I don't feel comfortable to like really engage with them in that way if they start, because it's their house, and I don't feel comfortable to tell them about, well, you can't discuss this in your own house. I think before the election, I was more likely to, like, the general idea I would take to my own Facebook page was, I don't necessarily post things, I don't post personal things or like my family or pictures like that on my Facebook page. I usually post, you know, articles that I think are interesting or could help, whatever. So I thought in that election period, I was posting a lot of, you know, this is why you should not choose Trump. Like, he's similar, like, you know, guys, before World War II, like, this was the political situation going on with, this was the political situation, sorry. Okay, this was the political situation going on with Germany at this time before they decided to pick, you know, elect Hitler. And it's a similar situation. Sorry, one moment.
Thanks, Justus. Oh wait, okay, great, we're all back.
And they would be like, no, that, you know, I think even during the time when Obama was being, you know, the election period for Obama, people there, lots of people.
Maayan,
oh, Obama.
Can you put your earbud?
Oh, you can't hear me?
Yeah, you're getting a little bit challenging for me to hear. I don't know if it's true for others.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it better? Oh, okay.
Yes.
So, you know, so I was saying, like, you know, it was a similar situation to, you know, the precursors to electing Hitler, the same thing that happened with Trump. Now, and even with Obama, people, I remember at the Shabbos tables, people were saying, oh, Obama has this like Hitler-esque type way of speaking, like that really encourages, like that really gathers a crowd and really encourages people to just influences people in great numbers, like this almost irresistible pull to like, oh, we have to support that guy now. So they felt that about him, and I was like, no, that's not exactly. But but again,
Maayan, I want to like just point out like one quick thing, right? And I just want to make sure that I want to share this, is that Trump is not the cause or the problem. He's a symptom, right? And like the problems that we have predated the 2016 election, predated Trump's ascendancy. What Trump has been able to do is in many ways energize a movement that Graie was mentioning, grew out of a response to the success of the civil rights movement and gave them a platform, right? And and was really able to create, like move them basically from the fringe to the mainstream, right? These are not new views, not new attitudes. And yet we're at a moment now where people feel like it's okay to cause violence publicly. It used to be socially unacceptable to do some of the things that are now acceptable again. And I just like, and right? Yeah.
And I just see like lots of people just glossing, like, lots of white Jewish people just glossing over the fact that these violent things are happening. They just kind of, like these violent things happen and they're just in love with the other, like, let's concentrate on the positive things that he's been doing for our country. Like he put the embassy for the American embassy in Israel, in Jerusalem. Like, he's so good for Israel. And it becomes this concentration on, what's good for Israel. But right now, I think we really need to be concentrating on what's good for America, because there's a time and place for talking about Israel. And of course, I love Israel. I'm married to Israel. But but at the same time, right now we have this issue. We're living in America. We're in this country. We have to focus on making it better for the community that is here. I'd read a quote the other day about how I was reading in Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' book about leadership in his Parsha discussion for Messiah. And he said, I think he was quoting Jeremiah, or I can't remember whether it was Jeremiah or Isaiah he was quoting, but he said that, in order for all of us to prosper, we need to support the city that we live in. And we have to be leaders in supporting the city that we're in, regardless of if it's going to benefit, like purely for our benefit or not. We have to look out for everyone in the city. And when we do that for everyone, then we will also prosper as well. So well there's said. And I think our group wanted, we initially created the After the Ugly Cry thing to also be a group of action. So a few of us within that group organized the protest and then decided to call ourselves Caravelt, which is called, it means turn the world over in Yiddish. And so it's the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, his call for us, if you saw the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, the Holy Temple burning down, wouldn't you turn the world over to change that, make it better, to bring peace? And it was Lashon Hara, it was bad speech, it was like violence that helped to create the situation where the temple was burned down. So wouldn't you do everything in your power to create peace and justice in your community, around your community, in order that the Holy Temple would still exist today, and even to bring the Holy Temple, the third temple, to fruition now. So that's what we're named after. Turn the world over, Caravelt. So yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And thank you, Rabbi, for giving us the direct source and citation here. Yirmiyahu 29, seek the prosperity of the city where I sent you. I think, and I'll just say my own personal opinion also, is that the safety and security and prosperity of Israel is absolutely connected to the safety, security, and prosperity of American Jews in the United States. Like, I don't think that there is a way to separate that out. And I think that we have to your point, Maayan, we have to concentrate on where we are right now, but our ability to do that actually helps Israel too. With that, it's 3 o'clock. Let's do the last 15 minutes. Let's go into some Q&A. Justus, you've been following the Q&A thread. What do we have?
Yeah, so there's some good activity in the Q&A. Let me start. This will be, I think, mainly for you, Graie, but Maayan, you may have a comment as well. We learned in the last session about like who were the Jews who were participating in movement work. Was it from the organized Jewish community? Was it secular folks or leftists or those kind of? Since we're talking about the moment today, could you? I mean, you kind of locate yourself, I think, in more like a real progressive Jewish side of the world. But maybe if I could ask you to kind of speak from the balcony a little bit, how do you see? What kinds of Jews are you seeing in movement work right now? Younger, older, secular, religious. What is your analysis of the level of participation of the organized Jewish community in movement work? Where are there opportunities? How should we judge ourselves as a community right now in terms of whether we're showing up well, very poorly? Where do you see it?
What a very large and interesting question. Trying to take it all in to figure out like where to. I think I'm seeing us show up across the spectrum as one would assume we would, right? If we are a vast and vibrant and robust community, we're showing up in all kinds of ways. And I think that also speaks to our history as well, right? I think that there are people who are showing up very explicitly and like publicly and visibly as Jewish and are saying, I am here because this is a reflection and this is how I live Jewishly, right? And are showing up in movement space in that way. I think there are folks who are showing up because they're feeling like, particularly in this new political moment since 2016 and like the visible rise of a white nationalist right, I think there's folks who are showing up because they're feeling newly afraid. They're feeling newly like kind of the covenant of America no longer is protecting them as Jewish people. I think there's folks who are showing up because they're seeing kind of this moment to reconcile some of the difficulty of that history of what is a covenant that's been extended to American Jews that's not been extended to lots of other demographic minority populations in the United States, right? And we see that clearly, right? Like Muslims in America don't have the same kind of integrated protections as like Jews have in America, for instance. I think there's folks who are showing up who are not interested in engaging their Jewish identity in a religious sense, but have a cultural, political sense of Jewish identity and are showing up from that place and from that history, whether it's kind of the history of like red diaper babies, or it's the history of civil rights participation or labor movement participation. And I think folks are showing up across a pretty broad spectrum of what it means to them right now, right? And I think about, I was not present in Charlottesville for the Unite the Right rally in 2017, but I was there in 2018 for the first year anniversary. And I was in Charlottesville, and I was also in DC for the official anti-Unite the Right rally that happened. And I want to go to that moment because I think that that moment was such the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville 2017 was such a catalyst moment for a lot of folks, right? In the same way that I think the 2016 presidential election kind of put people into like something shifting. You know, I feel maybe not personally attacked, but I feel like I got to pick a side of history to be on right now. There's a bit of history that I oftentimes think gets kind of glazed over, and that starts with Whitefish, Montana, February 2018, right, in which Richard Spencer and other folks really start to come on the map. And all of that has to do with, again, kind of the anti-Semitic undergirding of the white nationalist political ideology, right? Literally, the planned white nationalist takeover of Whitefish didn't happen because doing a march in February in Montana is just logistically a bad idea. And so they turned their attention, right, to Virginia in August and saw all these elements of the right come together and very clearly communicating part of the central idea of their political ideology of Jews will not replace us, right? They clearly see demographic shifts as a deep threat to a white ethno-state in the United States, right? And so that's this moment where suddenly Jews are named as a cornerstone enemy of the white nationalist movement. And I think lots of folks reacted with this, like, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss here, but like this, like, oh, snap, crackle and pop, we might be, we're on the map now as a target. And I think trying to figure out then where to turn that energy. And so I remember 2018 being there and seeing like kind of hardcore anarchist, Antifa Jewish folks who are showing up saying like, I'm Jewish, but like this is where I'm positioned politically, and seeing conservative rabbis, seeing reform rabbis, seeing renewal rabbis, seeing folks who are like, I'm an organizer, maybe I go to shul, maybe I dive in on occasion, but I'm not really connected religiously. But seeing lots of folks come to the space and say like, we have to be a part of this for all the kinds of reasons that folks are claiming position and wanting to be in movement with folks and seeing themselves as deeply connected to the possibility. And I think that has always been true about how we kind of collectively and individually show up in movement spaces.
Thank you, Graie. All right, so the next question is to go a little bit local for you, Maayan. You live at one of the primary intersections or seams between Black communities and Jewish communities and those who have one foot in both over a generation or two, right there in Crown Heights. There, in 1967, there was the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school district problem. Huge amount of friction between the communities in the 1990s, the Crown Heights riots. In 2018, a Black Jewish activist was basically attacked when he was carrying a Torah to tutor someone for their bar mitzvah. What are things like today? How do you personally experience, living in that intersection? Could you tell us, do you have thoughts about how Jews in Crown Heights, how Blacks in Crown Heights, how Jewish people who identify as people of color in Crown Heights are experiencing this moment? And do you think there's any wisdom about the lived experience there for other places in the country?
Thank you. I have experienced, okay, so how do I think about this? So I have currently, I think I started living in Crown Heights about 2005. And so I'd had a lot of, and I was also new to the Chabad, like the Chabad experience at all. I'd moved from Manhattan, and actually when I was in Manhattan, I was going to a conservative synagogue, and then moved to Crown Heights, and I was like, well, I can't travel on Shabbos. I have to find another shul. So found 770 by other chance, by a whole lot of interesting coincidences, and thought, okay, I should go there, but had some interesting experiences with that. And then later on, just kind of getting to know the neighborhood, getting to know more about the lachot and like Jewish law and like how the neighborhood necessarily kind of functions. Getting to know that aspect of things, I could better navigate it in terms of, okay, well, I don't need to interact with this person. Like, I can create my own bubble, so to speak, of people who are like-minded and who will not treat me in a way that I don't want to be treated. It doesn't mean that it's not happening. you know, I'd been for a few years, maybe until just recently, like maybe about 2017, 2018, a friend of mine, I'd met another Jew of color, and she was like, oh, I'm from DC and I also live in Crown Heights. And I'm like, we must meet. And then it turned out that she's on the board of an organization called Jewish Multiracial Network, and Chava Shervington, if anyone knows. But in any case, so met her, and she's like, oh, we're having events, like bring your family. And so I, you know, going to the first event, you know, I didn't realize that I needed to be with other Jews of color, like, because up until that point, I was more or less like going around by myself, just winging it a little bit there, and just kind of like whatever experience happens, okay. And yeah, but I didn't really know that, you know, I didn't realize that I did need that kind of support and solidarity from other Jews of color to, you know, and that we all, like, you know, I'm like, oh, it's not just you too? You also had that experience? Oh, thank God. I'm like not going crazy, you know, because that's, you know, because I felt like, you know, if I'd gone to another, you know, white Jewish person and said like, oh, I think I'm being discriminated against or something, I would be told, are you sure? I think you might be overthinking that. You know, it's very possible that that's really just all in your head. But I didn't grow up like that. I didn't grow up in an environment that, you know, I grew up in DC. I didn't grow up in an environment where people were outward, like, just like obviously racist towards me in the ways that I have experienced in Crown Heights. Now, compared to 2005 to now, I think it's significantly better, but there's still more to do in that space. You know, in some other WhatsApp chat I was in, somebody, it's just kind of like, I don't necessarily participate in it too much. It's a Craigslist group kind of. But in any case, somebody said, you know, what have Jewish people ever done to Black people ever? You know, I've never been mean to a Black person and that sort of thing. And in my head, I thought, have you listened to your Shabbos table lately? You know, about, it's like, it's very hurtful. You may not physically, a person may not physically abuse a person, but to verbally say, Schwarze das, goy that, it's very painful. And I still go through that, you know, with my own children sometimes. Other kids around them will come and say, you know, because my children are biracial. So they kind of, I guess they're white passing in some manner. But they still get, like, if I come to pick them up, other children might say, is that your babysitter? Is that your goy? And then they'll explain, oh no, that's my mom. And then they'll go, wait, so are you Jewish, like young child here? Like, are you? So they start to question their own identity, and they don't have to, you know, and they don't have to, other children don't have to go around thinking about their skin color, but my children have to constantly, you know, to the point where they're deciding, like, I guess I'm orange. I guess orange is going to be my color now. Like, I'll be an orange person. But in any case, is it better? I mean, okay, it is getting slightly better. I think there, you know, with the Vogue article, lots of people were curious. They're like, I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know that these subtle things mattered. They just weren't aware. So, you know, we recently had a Zoom event. My organization, Caravel, had a Zoom event where myself and another Jew of color, Yafi Newman, discussed the experiences of being Black and Jewish in the neighborhood or just in Jewish communities. And there are lots of people who were just curious, like, I did not know, like, this serious, you know, I didn't know, and I need to educate myself more. So I see that they are willing to listen and open up their ears about the whole thing. Now, as for the Black community, like, I've definitely had the experience of experiencing anti-Semitism from the Black community. Like, one time we're trying to move our car because someone was blocking our driveway. So I went to the neighbors and I said, hey, do you know whose car it is? You know, we just want to get out. So some guy openly says, I wouldn't be helping no Jews, he tells to the rest of the group. And so the others were like, hey, come on, man, you know, she's Black too, and that kind of thing. So, and I went over to him and said, look, I'm Jewish, because I honestly think that there's the perceived thing of just Jews are white, like Jews equal other white people. I think there's that, and I'm kind of curious, you know, if the Black community knew that there are a large number of Black Jewish people, would they continue to have the same opinions about Jewish people if they did that? So there's that, yeah. So I think that will be, yeah, that's all I can think of right now.
Thank you. All right, so in a second, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ginna, to maybe wrap it up for us. I just want to say really quickly, for those of you who are able, there is a link in the chat to a survey, a quick survey that you can fill out to provide feedback about this series. We really would love your input. The Q&A is very active. Maayan and Graie, there's a lot of people who have a lot of questions that we're not going to get to because we're out of time. Frankly, I have a lot more questions that I want to ask you that we're not going to get to because we're out of time. So thank you. But Ginna, why don't you close this out?
Thanks, Justus. It's right at 3:15. So I'm going to quickly just actually share something, Justus, that you shared with me yesterday, which was the quote from Cory Booker in a piece in the foreword that I'm going to close out. First, Maayan, Graie, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Really appreciate your bringing your wisdom and your expertise to the Hartman community. And just before everyone goes, here's what Cory Booker said in a piece in the foreword. I get delighted when I see some teenage white girls speaking out about racial issues in a way that my ancestors and author James Baldwin would be proud of. He said, "This gives me delight and gives me sustenance, but I can't get comfortable. I can't believe that somehow we've got momentum that sustains." He then singled out two groups that have experienced fighting long battles against injustice, Jews and African Americans. The communities, quote, have been forced to figure this out for at least eons, he said. It's not up to Jewish people to defend anti-Semitism, or to defend not being anti-Semitic, rather. It should be Black folks, Christian folks, Muslim folks, in the same way that I don't want to have to be the one to call out racism every time. So I think that's the charge that we all have going forward, is to recognize the racism in our own communities and call it out when we see it, regardless, and do the same thing with anti-Semitism and be just aware that it goes both ways. And the work that we have as a Jewish community is both internal, recognizing what we have done and what we do to uphold systems of white supremacy in our own communities and our own shuls and our own institutions, and also recognizing what is the power that we have in this moment to bring all that we have to bear on Caravelt, on turning the world over. This is the time, this is the moment, and really excited that we had two amazing people with us today to have this conversation. Thank you both, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Graie. Thank you, Maayan. Thank you, Ginna. Have a good rest of your day.